The red dust of the Texas Panhandle settled on everything, a fine grit that coated Cole Hardin's tongue and clung to the sweat on his neck. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Buck, plodded with the weary patience of an animal that knew this heat was not a momentary affliction but a permanent state of being. The town of Broken Mesa appeared first as a shimmer, then as a collection of low, sun-bleached buildings huddled together as if for comfort against the vast, unforgiving plains. It had a saloon with swinging doors that gasped in the wind, a small train depot that looked more like a forgotten shed, and a sheriff's office with a faded star painted on the window. A white church steeple pointed a finger at a sky so blue it hurt to look at. This was it. This was the place he had chosen to start over, or at least to stop running. Cole swung down from Buck in front of the land office, his joints popping in protest. Inside, a small man with a green visor and ink-stained fingers scurried out from behind a tall desk. The man, Mr. Gable, seemed perpetually surprised, his eyes wide behind thick spectacles. He sold Cole the house for a price that was more of an apology than a transaction. It was an old place, he explained, on the edge of town. The previous owner had passed on, a matter of some unfortunate accident, he mumbled, shuffling papers to avoid Cole's gaze. The key felt light in Cole's hand, a flimsy piece of rusted metal for a place meant to be a home. He led Buck down the main street, which was little more than a wide dirt track. People watched him from the shadows of wooden awnings, their faces shuttered and curious. He nodded at them, his expression neutral, receiving only curt, almost fearful, nods in return. A tension hung in the air, thicker than the dust, a collective holding of breath. He could feel it, the same way he could feel the coming of a storm or the unease in a line of soldiers before a charge. Something was wrong with this town. The house stood alone, set back from the road and flanked by two skeletal cottonwood trees. It was a simple timber structure, its wood weathered to the color of old bones. The porch sagged, and each step he took on it produced a groan of protest, a long, weary sound of surrender. The smell hit him as he pushed the door open, old pine, dry rot, and the faint, lingering scent of a life abruptly ended. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows. The place was empty, stripped of all furniture, all signs of the person who had lived and died here. He walked through the small living space, his boots echoing in the silence. His eyes, trained by years of scanning horizons for threats, took in the details. Most of the floor was covered in a uniform layer of dust, thick and undisturbed. But in the center of the room, one section was different, a single floorboard, newer than the others, its grain lighter, its edges cleaner. It had been replaced recently. Kneeling down, he saw faint scratch marks in the wood around it, long gouges as if a heavy object with a metal lock had been dragged across the floor again and again. Stranger still was the dust. Around this new board, the dust had been swept away. Not thoroughly, but in a wide, circular pattern, as if someone had tidied one specific spot and ignored the rest. A shiver, unwelcome in the oppressive heat, traced its way down his spine. This was not the neatness of a housekeeper. It was the careful, deliberate erasure of a sign. A splinter from the rough door jamb lodged itself in his palm as he went back outside to fetch his saddlebags. It was a stupid injury, a careless wound, but it was deep. By midday, his hand was throbbing, a line of red creeping up his wrist. He had seen enough field injuries to know better than to ignore it. He asked a man stacking barrels outside the general store where he could find a doctor. The man jerked a thumb down the street toward a small, tidy building with a neatly painted sign that read, June Whitaker, physician. He found Dr. June Whitaker inside, grinding something in a mortar. She was not what he had expected. He had pictured an old man smelling of whiskey and mothballs. Instead, she was young, with intelligent brown eyes and hair the color of dark honey pinned up in a practical knot. A few stray strands framed a face that was both serious and possessed of a warmth that seemed out of place in Broken Mesa. She looked at him, her gaze direct and assessing, then at his hand, which he held awkwardly at his side. She gestured to a stool without preamble, telling him to sit. Her voice was calm and clear. He explained he had gotten a splinter. She examined the wound with gentle, efficient fingers, her touch surprisingly firm. She told him it was more than a splinter. It was a nasty gush that needed cleaning and a tetanus shot. He must have flinched at the mention of a needle, because a smile touched the corner of her lips. She asked him, with a teasing lilt in her voice, if the big stoic cowboy was afraid of a little needle. Her wit was as sharp and clean as her instruments. Cole looked from the gleaming needle she held to the light in her eyes. He replied that he was not afraid, but he was cautious, especially when the person holding the needle seemed to be enjoying the prospect so much. Her laugh was a low, pleasant sound. She cleaned and bandaged the wound with a practiced skill that spoke of great experience. As she worked, she made small talk, asking what brought him to their quiet little corner of the world. He told her he had bought the old Miller place. The name seemed to hang in the air between them for a moment. The light in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a guarded expression. She finished her work, her movements suddenly brisk. All she said was that he should keep the bandage clean and that he would find Broken Mesa was a town that kept to itself. It was not a welcome, but it was not a warning either. It was a simple statement of fact. Leaving the doctor's office, he almost collided with a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a sheriff's star. The man's face was a roadmap of sun and time, his eyes a faded blue that had seen too much. He introduced himself as Sheriff Amos Pike. He said he had seen Cole ride in. The sheriff's gaze drifted to the edge of town, in the direction of Cole's new house. The sheriff told Cole he had heard he bought the old house. Cole confirmed it. Pike's eyes met his, and the weariness in them was profound. The sheriff's voice was low when he spoke again, advising Cole to be careful. That house, he said, had connections to the McKendry family. He strongly suggested that Cole not go poking around in things that did not concern him. The name McKendry was spoken with a certain weight, a mix of reverence and fear. Cole had heard it whispered in the general store. The McKendrys owned the largest cattle ranch in the county. They owned the saloon. Rumor had it they owned half the town, including the people in it. Silas McKendry, the head of the clan, was a man who cast a long shadow. Now, it seemed, that shadow fell across Cole's new doorstep. The sheriff's warning was clear: the house held secrets, and those secrets belonged to powerful men. Men who did not like being disturbed. Cole spent the rest of the day buying meager supplies, a sack of flour, coffee, beans, and a side of bacon. He worked on the house, sweeping away the thick dust, his mind replaying the sheriff's words. He was starting to understand the silence of the townsfolk, the tension in the air. Broken Mesa was a town living under a quiet siege. Everyone depended on the McKendry ranch for their livelihood, for the cattle drives that brought money and life to this dusty outpost. In return for that prosperity, they offered their silence. They turned a blind eye to the things that powerful men did in the shadows. The law, in the form of the tired and overwhelmed Sheriff Pike, was a suggestion, not a command. Justice was a commodity, and Silas McKendry was the highest bidder. Cole had seen it before, in other towns, in the war. He had just hoped this place would be different. As night fell, a profound cold seeped out of the ground, a stark contrast to the day's blistering heat. Cole sat on the creaking porch, a tin cup of coffee in his good hand, watching the stars blaze to life in the ink-black sky. He had not come here looking for a fight. He had come here for peace, for a place to quiet the ghosts of the war that still marched through his dreams. He wanted to feel the simple satisfaction of mending a fence, of a long day's work under the sun, of a life built with his own two hands. He did not want to get involved in the town's silent, ugly war. Later, lying on his bedroll on the floor of the main room, he listened to the old house settle. It moaned and sighed, the wood contracting in the cold. A coyote yipped in the distance, its call a lonely, mournful sound. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Cole closed his eyes, trying to force the weariness to take him. He was just beginning to drift into a shallow sleep when he heard it. It was a soft sound, barely audible over the whisper of the wind outside. A faint, rhythmic tapping from directly beneath him. Tap, tap, tap. Pause, tap. It was not the sound of a mouse or a settling beam. It was deliberate. It was furtive. He lay perfectly still, every sense on high alert, his soldier's instincts screaming that something was wrong. The sound came again, and this time he could identify it with a chilling certainty. It sounded like fingernails, weak and trembling, scratching against the underside of the floorboards. Someone was down there. For a long moment, Cole did not move, letting the silence of the house press in on him. He held his breath, listening. The scratching came again, a desperate, feeble sound that spoke of a will that had nearly been extinguished. It was the sound of a trapped animal, but it was not an animal. He knew it with a certainty that settled like ice in his gut. He rose from his bedroll in one fluid motion, the years of cavalry training taking over. He lit the oil lamp, the flame chasing the darkest shadows into the corners, and grabbed the iron poker from the cold fireplace. He knelt beside the new floorboard. The wood was smooth beneath his fingers, a stark contrast to the splintered, aged planks around it. Using the tip of the poker, he wedged it into the thin crack and pried. The board resisted, then gave way with a low groan. A wave of air rose from the opening, thick with the smell of damp earth, rust, and something else, something human and unwashed. He held the lamp over the dark cavity. The cowboy bought an old house, and under the floorboards, he found a caged young woman covered in scars. She was huddled in the back of a crude iron cage, the sort a man might build to hold a large dog or a predator. Her form was small, almost childlike, wrapped in a tattered blanket. Her face was turned away from the light, hidden in shadow, but he could see the pale gleam of her skin and the dark mass of her tangled hair. He lowered the lamp further, his movements slow, deliberate. The light caught the skin of her back and shoulders, revealing a terrible tapestry of old scars, pale silver lines that crisscrossed her flesh like a map of cruelty. A low sound, a whimper of pure terror, came from the cage. She pressed herself tighter against the iron bars, trying to become smaller, to disappear. Cole's breath caught in his throat. The ghosts of the war rose up then. Images of burned-out farmhouses and the faces of civilians caught between two armies. He had seen the aftermath of brutality before, but this was different. This was happening now, under his own roof. He set the lamp down, his mind suddenly calm and clear, the shock replaced by a cold, focused purpose. He spoke, his voice a low murmur, the way he would speak to a spooked horse. "I am not going to hurt you. I am here to help." She did not respond, only trembled. He examined the cage. The door was held shut by a heavy padlock. He brought the lamp closer to it. Scratched crudely into the metal were two letters, S.M., Silas McKendry. The sheriff's warning echoed in his mind. This was McKendry's secret. This was the evil that the town had agreed to ignore. He did not have the key. He went to his saddlebags and retrieved a small tool roll with a file and a length of sturdy wire. He went to work on the lock. His hands, usually so steady, fumbled with the mechanism. The sounds of his work were loud in the quiet room, and with each scrape of metal, the girl in the cage flinched. He murmured to her the whole time, not saying anything of substance, just a stream of quiet sounds meant to soothe. After what felt like an eternity, the lock clicked open. He swung the cage door open slowly. It protested with a loud creak of rusted hinges. He backed away, giving her space, and sat on the floor a few feet from the opening. He did not look directly at her, instead focusing on a point on the far wall. He told her she was safe now. He told her his name was Cole. He waited. A long time passed. Finally, she stirred. She crawled forward, inch by inch, until she was at the edge of the cage, blinking in the lamplight. She was young, no more than a girl, her face gaunt and smudged with dirt. Her eyes were wide with a fear so profound it seemed to have hollowed her out. She looked at him, her gaze darting away the moment he met it. He pushed a canteen of water toward her, sliding it across the floor. She watched it as if it might be a snake. He unscrewed the cap for her and nudged it closer. Her hand, thin and trembling, reached out and snatched it. She drank greedily, the water spilling down her chin. When she was done, she whispered a single word, her voice raspy from disuse. "Rose." He nodded. "Rose, that is a good name." He took off his heavy canvas coat and laid it on the floor for her. He told her she could have it. He would not touch her. He promised he would not come any closer unless she said it was all right. Tears welled in her large, haunted eyes. She crawled out of the cage and pulled the coat around her small frame. Burying her face in the rough fabric, she began to sob, not loudly but with deep, silent, body-racking tremors. Cole sat there, a helpless statue, and let her cry. When her sobs finally subsided, she looked at him, a new, more urgent fear in her eyes. "Please," she begged, her voice a fragile thread of sound. "You cannot let them know. The owner, he will come back for me." Cole's jaw tightened. He knew who the owner was. He had seen his initials on the lock. He spotted something else in the cage, a small, leather-bound notebook lying near the tattered blanket. He reached in and picked it up. Inside, a neat script detailed a series of dates, each followed by a tally mark. The last entry was from 3 days ago. It was a schedule of visits. The full weight of his choice settled upon him. He could nail the floorboard back down, pretend he had found nothing, and ride out of Broken Mesa at first light. That was the safe option, the one that would allow him to live a quiet life. Or he could help this girl, and in doing so, declare war on the most powerful man in the county. It was not a choice at all. He had run from his past for too long. He could not run from this. He chose to save her. He told Rose they had to go, that it was not safe here. He found a thicker blanket in his saddlebags and gently wrapped it around her, making sure not to touch her skin. He scooped her up. She was as light as a bundle of sticks. She tensed in his arms, a gasp of fear escaping her lips. But she did not fight him. He carried her out into the pre-dawn chill, the world still painted in shades of gray and purple. The town was asleep. The only sound was the scuff of his boots in the dust and the whisper of the wind. He moved through the back alleys, keeping to the shadows, his military past serving him well. He went straight to the one place he thought might offer sanctuary, the one person who had shown him a spark of decency. He knocked softly on the door of Dr. June Whitaker's office. A light appeared in the window, and a moment later, the door opened a crack. June stood there, a robe pulled tightly around her, her hair loose on her shoulders. Her eyes widened, first in confusion, then in alarm as she saw the blanket-wrapped bundle in his arms. He spoke her name, his voice low and urgent. He needed her help. She opened the door without another word, ushering him inside and quickly bolting it behind them. He carried Rose to the examination room and gently set her down on the cot. When he pulled back the blanket, June made a small, strangled sound. For a moment, she was just a woman, horrified by the sight of the scarred, terrified girl. Then, the doctor took over. Her expression became focused, her movements swift and professional. She lit several lamps, flooding the small room with light. She spoke to Rose in a soft, reassuring voice, telling her she was a doctor and was there to help. She examined Rose's injuries, her touch gentle but firm, her face a mask of controlled anger. She cleaned the sores and cuts with antiseptic, her hands never faltering. She gave Rose a sedative mixed with water to calm her, and forced Cole to drink a cup of strong, hot coffee. She turned to Cole, her brown eyes blazing. "Do not say a word about this to anyone, not yet. Her safety is the only thing that matters right now. We need to be smart about this." Cole agreed. He left her tending to Rose and went to see the sheriff. He found Amos Pike in his office, drinking coffee that looked as black and bitter as his mood. Cole told him everything, leaving out no detail. Pike listened without interruption, his weathered face growing grimmer with each word. When Cole finished, the sheriff stared into his empty cup for a long time. He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a tired resignation. "The law is a tricky thing in this town. Hardin, you go the legal route, and Silas McKendry will tie it up with fancy lawyers until everyone forgets it ever happened. He will buy the witnesses, and he will buy the judge." Cole countered that they had to do something. Pike nodded slowly. He said he would do what he could, but he advised Cole to be careful. McKendry's reach was long. When Cole returned to his new house, the sun was fully up, painting the dusty landscape in harsh, bright colors. He saw them immediately. In the dirt just outside his front gate were the fresh prints of a single horse. The shoe was new. The market left crisp and clear. One of McKendry's men had already been there. He recognized the name Darrow from whispers in the town. He was known as McKendry's chief enforcer. They were being watched. He spent the day securing the house, reinforcing the door and shuttering the windows, his mind racing. Late in the afternoon, he went back to the doctor's office. June met him at the door, her face pale and strained. She told him Rose was sleeping, that the sedative had helped. Then she held up Rose's arm. June's finger traced a small, dark mark on the inside of the girl's wrist, almost hidden in the grime. It was not a scar or a brand made by a hot iron. It was a neat, precise tattoo, a small, stylized flower. June looked at Cole, her eyes wide with a new, dawning horror. "This is not random. Cole, this is a marker. It is a code." She said she had seen something like it once before, in a medical journal about the trade in stolen lives that operated along the railroad lines, hidden within certain high-class establishments. This mark, she said, was how they identified their property. Rose was not just a captive. She was merchandise. The discovery of the tattooed flower on Rose's wrist changed everything. It was no longer a matter of rescuing one captive from one cruel man. They had stumbled upon something organized, a sickness that had its roots sunk deep into the foundations of Broken Mesa and snaked its way out along the railroad lines. The small house on the edge of town was no longer just a refuge. It had to become a fortress, while June stayed with Rose, tending to her physical and emotional wounds. Cole went to work with the grim efficiency of a soldier preparing for a siege. He started with the doors. Fitting heavy wooden bars across them that could be dropped into iron brackets, he forged himself in the property's dilapidated smithy. He shuttered the windows, reinforcing the frames and adding smaller, secondary locks. The house became a dim, protected space. The harsh Texas sun held at bay. His most ambitious project was born from a memory of war, of secret tunnels and hidden escape routes. The small root cellar, accessed by a trap door in the kitchen, was a start. Armed with a shovel and a pickaxe, Cole began to dig. The work was brutal, the earth packed hard and dry. He worked through the day and into the night, his muscles screaming in protest, the rhythm of the work a balm for his troubled mind. He extended the cellar into a narrow tunnel, shoring it up with timber salvaged from a collapsed shed, until it emerged in the dark, hay-scented space of the small barn where he kept Buck. Now they had a way out, a path that was hidden from the main road. He also devised a simple signal system with June. A lamp left burning in the west-facing window after sundown meant all was well. If the window was dark, it meant trouble. In the quiet, shaded interior of the house, June waged a different kind of war. She fought against the terror that had taken root in Rose's mind. The girl was afraid of everything's sudden noises, the sound of a man's boots on the floorboards, the sight of her own reflection. June's methods were gentle. Her weapons were patience and kindness. She brought a small ticking clock from her office. its steady, rhythmic sound a constant in the quiet room. She taught Rose a breathing exercise, to focus on the sound of the clock and the rise and fall of her own chest when panic threatened to overwhelm her. She brewed endless cups of mint tea, the warm, clean scent filling the small house. The aroma became a symbol of safety, a tangible counterpoint to the lingering smells of rust and fear from the hole under the floor. Slowly, tentatively, Rose began to respond. The simple comforts, the steady presence of a kind woman, began to coax pieces of her story out. She spoke in fragments, her voice barely a whisper, of a poor farm in Missouri, of a man who had promised her a good job as a seamstress in a town to the west. She remembered a long train ride, the hope she had felt, and then the confusion when she was brought not to a dress shop, but to a large, imposing house. After that, her memories became a blur of darkness and fear. The simple, homey details of her life in Missouri, the smell of rain on the dust and the feel of her mother's hand, were the anchors June used to pull her back to the present. Sheriff Pike made good on his promise to help, though his help was as quiet and furtive as their own actions. He met Cole one night in the deep shadows behind the livery stable. He did not bring apologies or grand plans. He brought a stack of papers, reports of missing women and teenage girls from towns all along the Santa Fe line. Most were dismissed as runaways, their cases closed with little investigation. But looking at them together, a chilling pattern emerged. Young women, often poor and with no family to speak for them, disappearing without a trace. Pike's weary eyes told Cole that he had suspected something like this for years but had never had the proof, or the allies, to fight it. A week after Cole found Rose, Silas McKendry made a grand public gesture. He sponsored a bull riding competition, with all the proceeds going to the church building fund. It was a perfect display of his power, a demonstration of his supposed benevolence that also served to remind everyone in Broken Mesa who truly controlled their lives. Flags flew from the rooftops, the saloon offered free drinks, and the whole town turned out in their Sunday best. It was an event Cole knew he could not afford to miss. He had to see his enemy, to take his measure. He played the part of a simple, curious newcomer, a handsome but slightly naive cowboy just passing through. He leaned against the corral fence, watching the riders test their mettle against the furious, spinning bodies of the bulls. He saw Silas McKendry holding court near the judge's stand, a large, immaculately dressed man with cold, intelligent eyes. He was surrounded by his men, including the hulking figure Cole recognized as Darrow, whose gaze swept the crowd with a predator's idle menace. Reverend Ezra stood beside McKendry, his face a mixture of gratitude and unease, a man who had made a deal with a devil for the good of his flock. At a lull in the action, Cole ambled over, his walk a study in casual indifference. He approached McKendry as if to ask for a light for a hand-rolled cigarette. Silas turned, his eyes assessing Cole in a single, swift glance. He had heard about the new man in town, the one who had bought the old Miller place. A thin, knowing smile played on his lips. "Heard you bought that old house," McKendry said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Find anything valuable in there?" Cole took a slow drag from his cigarette, letting the smoke curl from his lips before he answered. He met McKendry's gaze, a faint smile on his own face. "Just a lot of dust. The kind wealthy folks often forget to sweep away." The words hung in the air between them, light as smoke but heavy with meaning. McKendry's smile did not falter, but his eyes hardened, the coldness in them intensifying. He knew. Cole's message had been received. The encounter was over in a moment, but a line had been drawn in the dirt. That night, Cole got the confirmation he expected. He was sitting in the dark of his living room when he heard the faint crunch of a boot on the dry ground outside. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. It was Darrow, moving like a shadow along the side of the house, testing the windows, checking the new bar on the door. He was scouting, confirming his master's suspicions. Cole did not confront him then. He waited. He knew Darrow would be back. 2 nights later, he was, this time, Cole was ready. He had stretched a thin wire across the path leading to the back of the house. When Darrow crept through the darkness, his foot caught the wire, and he went down hard. Before he could recover, Cole was on him, a pistol pressed to the back of his neck. He disarmed the bigger man with practiced ease, then used Darrow's own rope to truss him up like a hog for slaughter. He dragged him into the barn and left him there, hanging upside down from a rafter, to contemplate his mistakes until morning. When the sun rose, Cole cut him down. Darrow stumbled away, bruised and humiliated. Without a word, the message was sent, "I am not prey." While Cole engaged in this silent war of threats and intimidation, June was building her case. She meticulously documented all of Rose's injuries, writing her notes in precise, clinical language that was damning in its objectivity. She avoided any sensational details, focusing instead on the medical facts, creating a record that could, if the time ever came, be presented in a court of law. As the days wore on, the sky turned a hazy yellow-brown. A dust storm was rolling in from the plains. The wind picked up, howling around the small house, and the fine red dust began to seep through every crack and crevice. The world outside disappeared behind a thick, swirling curtain. The storm made their isolation complete, but it also made their situation more precarious. Water was already scarce in Broken Mesa, and the storm meant the wells would be fouled. The supply even more limited. Hiding a person became that much harder when every drop of water had to be accounted for. The parched, sun-scorched grass of the prairie seemed to mock them, a reflection of the town's own burned-out conscience. One evening, as the storm raged outside, June made her way to Cole's house, her face wrapped in a scarf. She brought fresh bandages and a small sack of herbs for her tea. Rose was sitting by the lamp, tracing the letters in a child's primer that June had brought her. She looked up and smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed her face. It was the first one Cole had seen. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he had not realized he had been missing. The old house, once just a shell, had started to feel like a home, a small, warm fortress against the storm outside and the evil within the town. After checking on Rose, June pulled Cole aside, her expression grave. She had been making quiet inquiries, talking to women who came to her for treatment, listening to the town's gossip. 2 more girls have gone missing. Cole, she said, her voice a low whisper that was nearly lost in the wind's howl. They disappeared last week. Both of them worked at the Magnolia Guest House. Cole knew the place. It was a respectable-looking establishment on the other side of town, a place where traveling salesmen and cattle buyers stayed. It was also, he now knew without a doubt, owned by a front company controlled by Silas McKendry. The Magnolia Guest House was the heart of the operation, and it had just claimed 2 more victims. The news that the Magnolia Guest House was not just a front, but an active hub in this vile trade settled like a shroud over them. Their small fortress, which had felt so secure against the howling dust storm, now seemed fragile, a tiny island of defiance in a vast sea of corruption. The knowledge spurred them into a new phase of their quiet war, a phase that required more than just defense. It required allies, information, and a courage that Rose, in her own quiet way, was the first to provide. Her trust in Cole and June had grown from a fragile seedling into a small, determined plant. She began to speak more, her voice gaining a little of its strength back each day. She now moved about the small house with a growing confidence, helping June prepare simple meals or sitting by the window, watching the world through the slivers of light in the shutters. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, with the scent of mint tea hanging in the air, that she gave them their most important clue. June had been humming a simple tune, and the sound seemed to unlock a door in Rose's memory. "There was music," she whispered, looking at a point on the far wall, her eyes unfocused. "In the other house. Not real music. It came from a box. It was loud, happy music, but it always made me feel cold. A pianola, the tinny, mechanical sound of a player piano, a common feature in saloons and guest houses, a cheap imitation of joy. She closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. The place smelled of tar, like they were fixing a roof, and it was always dark. The walls were wood, rough wood, like a cellar. The music came from upstairs, always upstairs. A wooden cellar, the smell of tar, and the relentless, cheerful sound of a pianola. It was a perfect description of the basement of a place like the Magnolia Guest House, a cellar where barrels of beer, often sealed with tar, would be stored, while the noise from the saloon upstairs would cover any sounds from below. Rose had given them the location of the nest. Now they needed a way inside, and for that, Cole needed a specialist. He needed a man who understood locks. He found him in the Mexican quarter of town, a small collection of adobe houses on the other side of the tracks. Mateo was a blacksmith, a man with arms like knotted oak and a face that was perpetually grim, as if he were angry at the very metal he hammered into shape. His forge was a dark, hot cave filled with the rhythmic clang of his work. Cole approached him cautiously. He knew from the town's whispers that Mateo had once been in debt to Silas McKendry, a debt that had cost him a piece of his land and all of his pride. He was a man nursing a deep and bitter grudge. Cole did not ask for help directly. He started by describing a unique kind of padlock he had found, one with a crude S and M scratched into its face. Mateo stopped his hammering, the sudden silence deafening. He turned slowly, his dark eyes boring into Cole. "I know the lock," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I made a dozen of them for McKendry 5 years ago. He told me they were for his cattle gates. I was a fool. I knew he was not a man who cared so much for his cows." Cole saw the shame and anger warring in the blacksmith's face. He saw his chance. "I am going to open one of those locks," Cole said, "and I'm going to find out what he truly keeps behind them." Mateo spat into the dust. "McKendry is a snake. He poisons everything he touches." The blacksmith looked at his own powerful hands, then back at Cole. "If a man wants to open a door that a snake has locked, he will need help. I will help you." It was not an offer of friendship. It was a vow of vengeance. While Cole secured his first ally, Sheriff Pike was following the money. He found a trail of bank drafts, large sums of cash being transferred from one of McKendry's front companies into a charitable fund, the Broken Mesa Church Building and Benevolence Fund. The payments were all authorized and countersigned by the church's treasurer, Reverend Ezra. Pike knew the Reverend was not a corrupt man, but he was a weak one, easily swayed by the appearance of piety and the promise of a new roof for his church. McKendry was not just buying the town's silence. He was laundering his dirty money through its soul. This discovery prompted June to take a risk of her own. She went to see the Reverend, not as a doctor, but as a member of his congregation. She found him in the cool, quiet sanctuary of the church, polishing the altar rail. She spoke to him of her work, of the vulnerable people she tried to help, and of the forces that sought to prey on them. She did not mention Rose by name, but she spoke of a lost soul in desperate need of a safe place, a sanctuary. Reverend Ezra listened, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. He looked around his empty church, at the beautiful stained glass windows that Silas McKendry's money had helped to buy. He was a man trapped between his conscience and his benefactor. He stammered, speaking of the good McKendry had done for the town, of the need for caution. June saw the fear in his eyes and knew she could not force him. She turned to leave, her heart heavy with disappointment. But as she reached the door, the Reverend called out to her, his voice a strained whisper. "Dr. Whitaker, wait." He hurried over to her, his face slick with sweat. He pressed a cold, heavy iron key into her hand. "The undercroft," he said, avoiding her eyes. "It is dry. No one ever goes down there. God forgive me. It is all I can do." It was not a declaration of war, but it was an act of quiet rebellion. The church had chosen a side. That night, Cole and Mateo put their plan into action. They moved through the darkness like ghosts. Circling around to the back of the Magnolia guest house, the cheerful, tinny music of the pianola spilled out into the night, just as Rose had described. They found a cellar door, its heavy slanted panels secured with a simple iron bar. Mateo worked it free with practiced silence. They slipped down into the darkness, the air thick with the smell of stale beer, damp earth, and the sharp, unmistakable scent of tar. The cellar was vast, a labyrinth of barrels and crates. They moved through it, their only light a small, hooded lantern. In the far corner, behind a stack of whiskey barrels, they found it, a new wall, its wooden planks not yet weathered like the rest of the cellar. And in the center of the wall was a heavy iron door. The lock on the door was one of Mateo's, the crude SM, a dark sigil in the lantern light. Cole put his ear to the cold iron. He could hear something, a faint, rhythmic sound. It was the sound of a chain being dragged slowly across a stone floor. His blood ran cold. They were here. The other girls were here. Before they could attempt the lock, they heard the crunch of boots on the gravel outside the main cellar door. A patrol. 2 men, their voices low and rough, were making their rounds. Cole and Mateo melted back into the shadows, pressing themselves behind the barrels, their hearts pounding. They waited, every muscle tense, until the footsteps receded. They had to retreat. They had confirmed the location of the prison, but they had been forced to leave the prisoners inside. The failed attempt left Cole on edge. The ghosts of his past were stirring, the memories of battles where he had been forced to retreat, leaving the wounded behind. He felt the familiar, terrifying pull of rage, the desire to charge in with guns blazing. He fought it down, knowing that reckless action would get them all killed. He had to be smarter. He had to be colder. June saw the struggle in him, the storm behind his quiet eyes. She was fighting her own battles. As a woman and a doctor, her reputation was her most valuable asset. By helping Cole, by hiding Rose, she was risking everything. If McKendry chose to, he could ruin her, painting her as a madwoman or an accomplice. Her good name dragged through the mud of this dirty town. And in the center of their quiet storm was Rose. She was getting stronger, but her fear was a living thing. The sound of a key turning in a lock could still make her flinch. The sight of Cole, a man she had come to trust, could still bring a flicker of old terror to her eyes if he moved too quickly. She was a constant, fragile reminder of what was at stake. A few days later, a new flyer appeared tacked to the notice board outside the general store. It was printed on expensive paper, announcing a special auction to be held at the Magnolia Guest House the following Saturday night. The flyer advertised the sale of precious horses, rare breeds from the East. But the wording was strange, full of coded phrases. It spoke of fine pedigrees and docile temperaments. Cole stared at the flyer, a feeling of dread washing over him. This was not about horses. This was a catalog. The precious horses were the girls trapped in the cellar. The auction was a slave market, hidden behind a veneer of respectable commerce. Saturday night. They had less than 3 days. The pianola at the Magnolia Guest House would be playing, and under the cover of its cheerful, soulless music, lives would be sold to the highest bidder. The flyer for the horse auction was a death warrant. Cole saw it not as paper and ink, but as a ticking clock, each word a second falling away toward the inevitable horror of Saturday night. The knowledge settled over their small house, a silence heavier and more oppressive than the dust storm that had just passed. They had 2 days. 2 days to assemble a plan that could break a fortified building and dismantle an operation that had the entire town in its pocket. 2 days to prepare for a fight they were hopelessly outnumbered in. That evening, the sky, scrubbed clean by the earlier winds, turned a bruised purple and yellow. The air grew heavy and still, a suffocating calm that was more menacing than the storm itself. Another one was coming, bigger this time. Cole could feel it in the ache in his bones, a familiar precursor to violence, both from the heavens and from men. He watched from the porch as the first tendrils of black cloud clawed their way over the horizon. When the storm hit, it came not with a howl but with a roar. Wind tore at the small house, which groaned and shuddered in protest. Rain came down in solid, driving sheets, turning the world outside into a churning gray chaos. And then came the thunder. It was not the distant rumble of a summer squall. It was a physical blow, a crack of celestial lightning that shook the very foundations of the house. A small, terrified cry came from Rose's room. Cole found her huddled in the corner, her hands over her ears, her body trembling uncontrollably. The terror in her eyes was absolute, a raw, primal fear that had nothing to do with the storm and everything to do with the dark, enclosed spaces and sudden, violent noises that had defined her life. June rushed to her side, but Rose flinched away from her touch, lost in her panic. Cole stopped in the doorway. He did not move closer. Instead, he sat down on the floor, his back against the doorframe, placing himself between her and the rest of the house, but leaving her space. "When I was a boy," he said, his voice quiet but steady, a low anchor in the roaring chaos, "my mother hated the thunder. It scared her something fierce. She taught me a trick. She told me the thunder was just God moving the furniture around upstairs. After the flash, you start counting. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, the number you get to before the boom tells you how many miles away the storm is. It gives the noise a reason, so he makes it smaller." Another peal of thunder shook the house. Rose whimpered, pressing herself tighter into the corner. "Count with me, Rose," Cole said gently. Right after the next flash, a brilliant fork of lightning illuminated the room, freezing everything in a stark, white light. 1 Mississippi. Cole began to count, his voice calm and even. 2 Mississippi, 3. The thunder crashed, closer this time. 3 miles, Cole said. "See, it is not on top of us. It is just passing by." June, seeing his intent, retreated to the main room and returned with a steaming cup of mint tea. She set it on the floor near Rose and went back to sit by the fire, giving them the illusion of privacy. Over the next hour, as the storm raged, Cole sat by the door, counting the seconds between lightning and thunder, his voice a steady, monotonous drone that slowly, miraculously, began to cut through Rose's terror. She uncurled from her ball, her trembling subsided, and she finally crept forward to retrieve the cup of tea, her small hands wrapped around its warmth as if it were a lifeline. Later, when the storm had settled into a steady, drumming rain and Rose was finally asleep, Cole and June sat by the fire, the lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The shared vulnerability of the evening had stripped away their usual defenses, leaving them quiet and thoughtful. "That was a good thing you did," June said, looking at him over the rim of her cup. "Where did you learn to be so gentle?" Cole stared into the flames, a muscle working in his jaw. "I have had to learn. I was not always this way." He fell silent for a long moment, the only sound the rain on the roof. "During the war, my company was tasked with clearing a small valley. We were told it was an enemy encampment. We went in hard and fast, too fast. It was not an encampment. It was a village. Farmers, old men, women, children. We were supposed to protect them. Instead, we brought the war right to their doorstep. I failed them. I see their faces sometimes. When it is quiet, the guilt of it is a weight a man learns to carry, but it never gets any lighter." His confession was stark, stripped of any attempt to excuse his actions. It was the plain, ugly truth of his past. June listened, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, her touch a small point of warmth against the chill of his memory. "I understand," she said softly, "why a person does what they do, why they choose to fight. I came out west because of my sister. She was younger than me, full of life. She took a position as a governess for a family moving to California. Her letters just stopped. No one knew what happened. She just vanished somewhere between here and there. I became a doctor because I wanted to fix things. But I could not fix that. I could not find her. So I came here, to the edge of everything, thinking maybe I could help stop another girl from just disappearing. They sat in silence. Two souls adrift in the vast, dark prairie, bound together by the ghosts of the people they could not save. Their shared pain was a bridge between them, more real and more solid than any spoken words of affection. The wound on Cole's hand, the one from the splinter he had gotten on his first day, had been bothering him again. He had caught it on a nail while digging the tunnel. June noticed him flexing his fingers. "Let me see that," she said, her voice shifting back to its professional tone. He held out his hand, and she gently unwrapped the bandage. The cut was clean but inflamed. She cleaned it with antiseptic, her touch light and efficient. He watched her, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way the firelight caught the honeyed strands of her hair. He found himself holding his breath. "Cowboy, do not hold your breath," she murmured, not looking up. "I am only touching the wound." "It is harder to breathe when the doctor stares that long," he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. She looked up then, her brown eyes meeting his. A small smile touched her lips. She finished tying the new bandage, but her hands lingered on his for a moment longer than was necessary. The space between them seemed to shrink, charged with a quiet, unspoken energy. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was not one of passion or demand. It was gentle, hesitant, a soft touch of lips that was over almost as soon as it began. It was a moment of profound and quiet recognition, an acknowledgement of the fragile hope that was growing between them. They pulled back, a silent understanding passing between them. This was not the time or the place, but the promise of it, the possibility, was now a living thing. From the doorway of her room, a small figure watched them. Rose stood in the shadows, her blanket wrapped around her. She had seen the kiss, but there was no jealousy in her eyes, no confusion. Instead, her expression was one of wonder, as if she were seeing a rare and beautiful bird for the first time. She looked from Cole's quiet strength to June's gentle compassion, and a tiny, hopeful smile touched her own lips. "Maybe," she whispered to herself, so softly that no one could hear, "maybe there are good people after all." The next day, with the deadline of the auction looming, they gathered to finalize their plan. Pike, Cole. June and Mateo met in the dim light of Cole's barn, their voices low. The plan was desperate, but it was all they had. Pike would create a diversion. He would stage a loud, public arrest of a drunkard in front of the Magnolia guest house, drawing the attention of the guards and the patrons. While the chaos unfolded out front, Mateo would use his skills to open the cellar lock at the back. Cole would lead the charge inside, to free the prisoners. June would be waiting nearby in a buckboard wagon, her medical bag ready, prepared to receive the rescued girls and take them to the secret undercroft of the church. They discussed where Rose should hide during the raid. The tunnel to the barn was the safest place, but as they spoke, Rose, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but firm, laced with a new and unfamiliar steel. "No, I will not hide underground." She took a deep breath, her small shoulders squared. She looked at the floorboards of the main house, visible through the open barn door. "I want to help, but more than that, I want to stand on my own 2 feet. I want to step up, myself, from the floorboards." Her words, a powerful echo of her own rescue, silenced them all. It was a declaration of independence, a refusal to be a victim any longer. She would not be hidden away. She would face the coming storm, not from a cellar, but from the solid ground she had reclaimed as her own. Cole looked at her, a fierce pride welling in his chest. A quiet moment of resolve settled over the small group. They had their plan. They had their purpose. They were ready. As dusk began to settle, Cole stood on his porch, watching the last light of the day bleed from the sky. The air was cool and clean after the rain. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something that resembled peace. It was shattered in an instant. A thin white envelope slithered under the front door, a pale snake in the fading light. Cole's hand went to his pistol. He moved to the door, picked up the envelope, and tore it open. The note inside was written in a clean, elegant script, the words stark and chilling against the white paper. Return the lost property. Saturday night. Saturday night descended on Broken Mesa not with a peaceful quiet, but with a feverish, artificial energy that all seemed to radiate from a single point, the Magnolia Guest House. The tinny, relentless music of the pianola spilled from its open doors, a sound of forced merriment that echoed through the dusty streets. Lamplight glowed from every window, silhouetting figures engaged in dancing and gambling, a tableau of manufactured joy. The entire town seemed to be participating in a collective act of willful ignorance. Their laughter and revelry a convenient curtain drawn across the building's dark foundation. From the shadows across the street, Cole, Pike, and Mateo watched. June was already in position, her wagon hidden in the deep darkness of an alleyway 2 streets over. Rose sitting beside her, a shawl covering her head, her small figure rigid with a mixture of terror and resolve. The note from McKendry had changed nothing in their plan. It had only sharpened their determination. It was not a negotiation. It was a declaration of ownership, and they were about to cancel the deed. Pike adjusted the battered hat on his head, his face set in grim lines. "It is time for the show," he said, his voice a low growl. He squared his shoulders and strode across the street, pushing through the swinging doors of the saloon with the weary authority of the law. Cole and Mateo waited, their hearts pounding in the tense silence. They heard a sudden commotion from inside, a man's voice raised in a drunken slur, followed by Pike's sharp, commanding tone. Then came the sound of a chair scraping back, a heavy thud, and a roar of outrage. The diversion had begun. Patrons, their curiosity piqued, began to spill out of the saloon's front entrance onto the porch, their faces turned toward the manufactured conflict. This was their chance, moving as one. Cole and Mateo slipped around the side of the building, hugging the deep shadows. They reached the slanted cellar doors at the back. As Mateo knelt, his powerful hands assessing the simple iron bar, Cole stood guard, his pistol drawn, his eyes scanning the darkness. From inside the saloon, he could hear Darrow's voice, a furious bellow of indignation. Pike was a master of his craft. He had chosen his target well, goading McKendry's enforcer into a public spectacle. The bar slid free with a muffled groan. They lifted the heavy doors just enough to slip through, then lowered them silently back into place. The cellar was just as they remembered it, a cool, dark space thick with the smells of tar and damp earth. The cheerful music from the pianola was a muffled, rhythmic pulse from above, a grotesque heartbeat for the House of Horrors. They lit the hooded lantern, its small pool of light barely pushing back the oppressive darkness. Moments later, the cellar doors opened again. It was June, her face pale but determined, helping Rose down the steep wooden steps. Rose was trembling, but her eyes were wide and focused. She was not the same girl Cole had found cowering in a cage. She was a survivor. And tonight, she was a guide. "Which way?" Cole whispered. Rose closed her eyes, tilting her head as if listening to a distant melody. She pointed a small, steady hand toward the back of the cellar. "The music is loudest from there, and the floor, it vibrates more." He kept a storeroom behind the whiskey barrels. They moved through the labyrinth of crates and barrels, Rose leading them not by sight but by a map of remembered sensations. She navigated the darkness with an unerring certainty, her past trauma now honed into a weapon. They reached the new wooden wall and the heavy iron door with its ugly, familiar lock. Mateo went to work immediately. his tools moving with a swift, silent precision. As the blacksmith focused on the lock, June noticed another door, smaller and set deeper into the stone foundation, one they had missed on their first reconnaissance. It was made of solid oak and bolted from the outside. Her doctor's intuition told her it was important. She gestured to Cole, who used the butt of his pistol to knock the heavy bolt free. The room inside was small and meticulously clean. It held a narrow cot, a cabinet of medical supplies, and a small desk. On the desk lay a thick ledger. June opened it. Her breath caught in her throat. It was not a medical log. It was a record of transactions, filled with dates, sums of money, and a column of codes. Each code was a small, stylized flower, identical to the one tattooed on Rose's wrist. Beside each code was a notation of a girl's age, hair color, and other attributes. It was a stock book, in a drawer. She found what she had dreaded most: a map, marked with towns along the Santa Fe Railroad, a spider web of distribution for human lives. A soft click from the main cellar brought her back to the present. Mateo had defeated the lock. Cole pushed the heavy iron door inward. The stench of unwashed bodies and despair rolled out to meet them. The space beyond was a short, narrow corridor with 3 cells, their doors made of thick iron bars. 2 were empty, their straw bedding fouled. In the third, 2 young women were huddled together, their faces streaked with tears, their eyes wide with terror in the lantern light. They were the girls who had disappeared from the guest house. Cole spoke to them in a low, calm voice. "We are here to get you out. Do not be afraid." Suddenly, a voice, cold and dripping with condescending amusement, echoed from the far end of the corridor. "I am afraid it is a bit late for a rescue." Silas McKendry stepped out of the shadows, a pristine suit on his back and a silver-plated revolver in his hand. Beside him stood a thin, wiry man with dead eyes, a professional gunman Cole had not seen before. "You have been a considerable nuisance, Cowboy," Silas said, the revolver held loosely at his side. "I provide order and prosperity to this town. In return, I require a certain amount of privacy for my hobbies. You have violated that privacy." He raised the pistol and fired. The shot was not aimed at any of them. It was a warning, a deafening explosion in the confined space that ricocheted off the stone walls. The 2 girls in the cell screamed. The gunman beside Silas raised his own weapon, but Cole was faster. His shot was not a warning. It was a precise, calculated action, a bullet that slammed into the gunman's shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol clattering to the floor. In the same instant, Mateo, who had been standing back in the shadows, let fly with the heavy blacksmith's hammer he had carried. It spun through the air like a deadly discus, catching the gunman in the chest and sending him to the ground in a heap. Darrow appeared in the doorway then, his face contorted in a mask of rage, drawn by the sound of the shots. He charged forward, but Pike was right behind him, his own pistol drawn. "Cover them!" Cole yelled. A chaotic firefight erupted in the narrow hallway. Cole used the barrels as cover, his shots precise, aimed to wound, not to kill. He would not create more innocent victims. He saw Darrow go down, a bullet from Pike's gun taking him in the leg. In the confusion, Silas moved with the speed of a striking snake. He lunged for the person nearest to him. He grabbed Rose, pulling her in front of him as a shield, the muzzle of his silver revolver pressed against her head. The shooting stopped. "Drop your weapons," Silas snarled, his composure cracking, a raw desperation showing in his eyes. "Or the girl dies." Rose trembled in his grasp, a small bird in the fist of a hawk. But she did not collapse. She did not cry. She stood as straight as she could and looked directly at Cole. Her voice was a small, defiant whisper, but in the sudden silence, it rang like a bell. "I am not property." Cole held his pistol steady, his eyes locked on Silas. He did not lower his weapon, but he did not raise it either. He began to talk, his voice calm, trying to buy time, to find an opening. "Let her go. McKendry, it is over. Silas laughed, a high, unhinged sound. Over, this is my town, my rules. As he spoke, he was distracted, his focus entirely on Cole. He did not see Pike, who had slipped back into the main cellar and was now circling around behind him through the darkness. A single, sharp crack echoed through the cellar. Silas's revolver flew from his hand, clattering against the stone floor. Pike had shot the weapon, not the man. In that split second of shock and pain, Silas shoved Rose away from him. She stumbled backward, and in her fall, her arm knocked an oil lamp from a nearby crate. It shattered on the floor, the oil spreading in a pool and igniting instantly. Flames roared to life, feeding on the dry straw and old wooden barrels. The cellar, which had been a dark prison, was instantly transformed into a blazing inferno. Black smoke filled the air, choking them. "Get them out," Cole yelled, grabbing the two rescued girls and pulling them toward the main cellar. Mateo, his face grim, helped the injured Darrow to his feet, dragging him along. June grabbed Rose, and together they all scrambled out of the burning corridor. June led them to a far corner of the cellar, where a low, arched doorway led to an old wine tunnel that, according to town legend, connected to the old mission. It was their escape route. Cole turned back. Through the churning smoke and roaring flames, he saw Silas McKendry staggering to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Cole walked toward him, a dark silhouette against the fire. "You think shooting me down is the end of it?" Silas screamed over the roar of the fire, his voice raw with hatred. "My money owns the courts." Cole stopped a few feet from him, the heat scorching his face. "No," he said, his voice cold and clear, "but she will never be under the floorboards again." He lunged forward, tackling Silas to the ground. He pulled a pair of iron handcuffs from his belt and snapped them onto McKendry's wrists. He hauled the stunned, sputtering man to his feet and began to drag him out of the fire, out of the darkness, and into the judgment that awaited him. He would not grant Silas the mercy of a quick death in the flames. He would force him to face the justice of the light. Outside, the Magnolia Guest House was a pillar of fire against the night sky. The patrons and the people of Broken Mesa stood in the street, their face illuminated by the blaze, watching in stunned silence as the symbol of their town's prosperity and its secret shame was consumed. Cole emerged from the smoke, dragging his cuffed prisoner. He threw Silas at Pike's feet. Later, as the fire began to die down and the local men formed a bucket brigade in a futile attempt to control the blaze, Pike sifted through the wreckage near the cellar entrance. A heavy, iron lockbox, blackened by soot but not destroyed, had been thrown clear by an exploding barrel. Pike pried it open. Inside, protected from the worst of the flames, was a bundle of papers. They were bank drafts, detailing the transfer of large sums of money, and every single one of them was countersigned, in a neat, flowing hand, by Reverend Ezra. The dawn that broke over Broken Mesa was gray and grim, the air thick with the acrid smell of burnt pine and shattered secrets. The smoldering skeleton of the Magnolia Guest House stood as a monument to the night's violence, a black scar on the heart of the town. The sheriff's office, by contrast, had become a beacon of frantic activity, a small, brightly lit island in the uncertain morning. Silas McKendry sat in a cell, his fine suit stained with soot, his face a mask of cold, silent fury. Darrow, his leg roughly bandaged, occupied the other cell, his usual brutish arrogance replaced by a sullen, fearful silence. Sheriff Pike, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep, moved with a renewed sense of purpose, taking statements and organizing the chaos. June was there, her presence a calm and steadying force. She had tended to the two rescued girls, who were now safely hidden in the church undercroft with Reverend Ezra, who watched over them with the frantic devotion of a man desperate to atone. June's medical report on the girl's condition was written in her clear, precise hand. a dispassionate account of neglect and cruelty that was more damning than any emotional testimony. Rose sat on a bench in the main office, a cup of tea warming her hands. She was quiet, her gaze distant. But the panicked terror that had once been her constant companion was gone, replaced by a fragile but determined composure. She was listening to the testimony of the two other girls, their whispered, fragmented accounts of their captivity. One of them mentioned being moved between two locations, sometimes hearing the saloon music, other times hearing nothing but the wind and a strange bird that called in the dead of night. Rose's head snapped up, her eyes suddenly sharp and focused. "A bird," she said, her voice quiet but clear. It sang 3 notes, always the same, like a whip poor will, but not. I used to hear it when they moved me. It was the only sound besides the wind. It came from the direction of the cemetery. Pike stopped his writing and looked at her. "The old gantry warehouse," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It backs up to the cemetery grounds. It has been empty for years." Cole, Pike, and Mateo left immediately. The warehouse was a large, dilapidated structure, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling. A heavy McKendry-made padlock secured the main doors. Mateo made short work of it. Inside, the air was stale and musty. In a small, windowless room at the back, they found her, a girl, even younger than Rose, curled on a pile of straw, her eyes wide with a silent, animal fear. She did not speak, she did not cry. She only stared as Cole gently wrapped her in a blanket and carried her out into the blinding light of a day she must have thought she would never see again. The rescue of a third girl and the public caging of Silas McKendry tore the fragile fabric of Broken Mesa's willful ignorance in two. The town, which had for so long maintained a united front of silence, was now openly at war with itself. One faction, led by the merchants and ranchers who depended on McKendry's vast cattle empire, spoke in hushed, fearful tones of ruin. They argued that Silas, for all his faults, brought prosperity, that his sins were the price of their survival. The other faction, stirred from their moral slumber, were filled with a righteous, simmering fury. The list of names from the ledger June had found was a roll call of their own missing cousins, nieces and neighbors from down the railway line. The abstract evil they had chosen to ignore now had familiar faces, and the guilt was a bitter pill to swallow. The conflict found its voice in the one place it could no longer be ignored, the church. That Sunday, Reverend Ezra stood before his divided congregation, his face pale and drawn. He did not speak of forgiveness or parables. He spoke of his own weakness, his own vanity. He confessed that he had been so eager to see his church thrive, so blinded by the promise of Silas McKendry's charity, that he had signed whatever papers were put in front of him. He held up the bank drafts Pike had found in the lockbox. "I helped this man wash the filth from his money," the Reverend said, his voice cracking with shame. "I allowed this house of God to be used as a shelter for his sins." He then publicly begged for the town's forgiveness and announced he was turning over every church record and ledger to Sheriff Pike. It was a stunning act of self-immolation, and in the pews, the factions of fear and anger sat in stunned, absolute silence. A week later, the circuit judge arrived, a stern, hawk-nosed man named Elias Thorne, who brought with him the full, impartial weight of the law. The town's small courthouse was filled to capacity for the preliminary hearing. Silas McKendry, now clean and dressed in a new suit brought by a slick, expensive lawyer from Austin, looked every bit the powerful cattle baron. His lawyer immediately began to spin a web of legal maneuvering, arguing that there was no concrete evidence linking his client to any crime, only the hysterical ramblings of troubled young women and the overzealous actions of a small-town sheriff. Threats, subtle and not so subtle, were made. Witnesses found their barns burned or their credit at the general store suddenly revoked. Cole and Pike established a round-the-clock guard on the church undercroft, ensuring the safety of the girls. The tide began to turn with an unlikely ally. Darrow, facing a long prison sentence, decided to save his own skin. He gave Pike a full confession, detailing the entire operation, the routes along the railroad, the names of the contacts in other towns who procured the girls, the system of codes and payments. He painted Silas as the undisputed king of a sprawling, evil enterprise. The hearing was a tense, dramatic affair. Judge Thorne listened patiently as McKendry's lawyer attempted to discredit every piece of evidence. June took the stand. Her testimony a cool, clinical recitation of medical facts that painted a horrifying picture of sustained cruelty. Her professional demeanor was unshakable, and the lawyer's attempts to rattle her failed completely. Then they called Rose to the stand. She walked slowly to the chair, her small frame looking impossibly fragile in the imposing room. The lawyer began his questioning with a series of condescending, invasive inquiries designed to confuse and intimidate her. But Rose did not look at him. She looked directly at the 12 men of the jury, men she had seen on the streets of the town, men who had averted their eyes from her. When the lawyer paused for breath, Rose spoke, her voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the room. "I have a name," she said. "My name is Rose, and I am a person." She said nothing more. She did not need to. Her simple, powerful declaration of her own humanity, of her own existence beyond being someone's property, was the most powerful testimony of all. The jury, which had been a collection of nervous, conflicted faces, now looked at Silas McKendry with a new, dawning horror. The final, irrefutable blow came from the back of the courtroom. Mateo, the blacksmith, walked forward, holding a heavy object in his hand. He presented to the judge the crude, heavy padlock he had removed from the cage in Cole's house. "Your Honor," Mateo said in his deep, rumbling voice, "I made this lock myself, on the order of Mr. McKendry. He asked me to scratch his initials into it." He pointed to the crude S and M on the lock's face. The physical evidence was undeniable. It was the chain that linked Silas McKendry, the respectable cattle baron, directly to the iron cage under the floorboards. Judge Thorne's gavel came down with a crack that echoed the finality of a gunshot. He ordered Silas McKendry held without bail and transferred to the county seat to stand trial for a list of crimes that would see him imprisoned for the rest of his life. For the first time, the cold composure of the cattle king shattered, his face contorting in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage as Pike led him away in chains. That night, the air over Broken Mesa seemed lighter, cleaner. The stars, which had been obscured for so long by the town's dark secret, now blazed with a brilliant intensity. Cole and June sat on the porch of the small house, the silence between them comfortable, companionable. The house was no longer just his, it was theirs, a shared symbol of their fight. June leaned her head against his shoulder, her weariness a tangible thing. He put his arm around her, and she settled into his embrace as if she had always belonged there. "When all this is over," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, "we should fix this place up right, put in a new floor, a bigger window, for anyone else who might need a safe place to land." Cole looked out at the vast, dark prairie. He thought of the long, lonely years behind him, the ghosts he had carried. They were still there, but they were quieter now, their voices fading. "Okay," he said, "we will." He held her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, gentle kiss that spoke not of passion, but of promise, of the slow, patient work of building a new life on the foundations of a healed one. It was a kiss that closed a door on the past and opened a window to the future. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A young boy from the telegraph office rode up, his face flushed with urgency. He handed a slip of paper to Cole. It was a message from one of Pike's contacts at the railroad. The message was short and to the point. McKendry's men were gathering. They were planning to intercept the prison wagon at Dry Needle Pass at sunrise. They were not going to let their king go down without a fight. The pre-dawn air at Dry Needle Pass was thin and cold, sharp with the scent of pine and stone. The pass itself was a narrow slash through a ridge of granite. The road a treacherous ribbon of dirt and rock flanked by steep, unforgiving cliffs. It was a perfect place for an ambush. It was also a perfect place for a trap. Cole and Pike had ridden out hours before the prison wagon was due, their horses picking their way through the darkness. Mateo had followed, leading a mule laden with heavy ropes and iron spikes. Cole, using the instincts honed by years of navigating hostile territory, found the spot he was looking for: a high, unstable scree slope, a cascade of loose rock and boulders held in a precarious balance above a sharp bend in the road. It was a natural rock slide, waiting for a push. Working in the frigid silence, they hammered Mateo's iron spikes into a deep fissure above the slope and rigged a system of ropes that led down to a sheltered ledge on the opposite side of the pass. One strong pull would be enough to bring a ton of rock and thunder down onto the road below. They settled in to wait, hidden amongst the granite tors. As the first pale light of dawn painted the eastern sky, they saw them, a dozen riders, moving with grim purpose, positioning themselves in the rocks on either side of the pass. McKendry's private army, loyal to his money even if not to him, had come to reclaim their king. Soon, the prison wagon rumbled into view, a sturdy, iron-barred box on wheels, flanked by two grim-faced deputies. As it entered the narrowest part of the pass, the first shot rang out, a sharp crack that echoed like a whip. The ambush had begun. From their hiding place, Cole watched the riders rise from their cover, their rifles glinting in the new morning light. Now he yelled to Pike. Together, they heaved on the rope. The mountain seemed to groan in protest. A cascade of pebbles turned into a river of rock, which in turn became an avalanche of massive boulders. With a deafening roar, the scree slope gave way, and a wall of granite crashed down onto the road, completely blocking the pass between the prison wagon and the majority of the ambushers. The ground shook, and the echoes of the rock slide bounced between the canyon walls, sounding like a dozen cannons firing at once. The ambushers, caught between the rock slide and the deputies, were thrown into chaos. The echoing shots and the thunderous roar of the avalanche made their small force sound like an entire cavalry troop. Panicked and cut off from their target, they fired a few wild, unaimed shots and then melted back into the rocks, their rescue attempt a dismal failure. The skirmish was over in less than a minute, a victory won not with bullets, but with strategy, stone, and the mountain itself. The prison wagon, its occupants shaken but unharmed, rumbled safely on its way toward the county seat and the justice that awaited its prisoner. When Cole and Pike rode back into Broken Mesa, the sun was high in the sky, and a different kind of change was in the air. The oppressive shadow of the McKendry name had finally lifted, and the town was taking its first hesitant breath of free air. The most visible sign of this transformation was at the site of the ruined Magnolia guest house. The blackened timbers and charred foundation had been cleared away. In their place, neat rows of newly turned earth had been laid out. June and Rose were there, kneeling in the dirt, carefully planting rows of wildflower seeds on the ashes of the town's darkest secret. They were cultivating a garden. The healing of Broken Mesa was slow and quiet. Like the growth of those seeds, it happened in small, everyday acts of courage and change. Rose, who had once been a prisoner of darkness, was now a student of the light. She spent her mornings with Reverend Ezra, who, as his own form of penance, was patiently teaching her to read and write. In the afternoons, she was with Mateo at his smithy, not near the fire, but in the corral out back. The blacksmith, whose grim silence masked a deep well of patience, was teaching her to ride. Cole watched her one day, her small figure atop a gentle mare, her initial fear giving way to a fierce, joyful concentration. She was not just learning to ride, she was learning to be free, to command her own direction. She began spending more and more time at June's clinic, her quiet, empathetic nature making her a natural healer. She learned to clean wounds, to grind herbs, to comfort the sick. The girl who had been treated as less than human was now dedicating her life to affirming the humanity in others. Cole's own life was undergoing a similar, quiet transformation. The small house he had bought as a temporary refuge had become a permanent anchor. He worked on it constantly, his hands finding a deep satisfaction in the simple, honest labor of building. He replaced the rotten porch steps, patched the roof, and put new glass in the windows. The dark, musty root cellar, which had once led to a tunnel of escape, he cleaned and whitewashed, turning it into a warm, dry room with a clean bed, a small pantry, and a solid, welcoming door. His house was no longer a fortress. It was a station, a place of rest for those who needed it, and the floorboard, the one that had covered the cage, he removed entirely. He sought a larger opening, framed it, and fitted it with a small, square window that faced the morning sun, a permanent fixture that let the light pour into the once darkest corner of the house. A month later, a letter arrived from the county seat. It was official. Silas McKendry had been convicted on all charges and sentenced to life at hard labor. His vast properties and holdings had been seized by the state, with a large portion set aside to create a fund to support the victims of his trade and to help other women and children in need across the territory. Justice, slow and hard-won, had finally been served. That evening, as the sun was setting, Cole found Rose standing in the living room, her hand resting on the sill of the new, low window. She was looking out at the wildflowers that were beginning to push their way through the dark soil where the magnolia had once stood. "I used to dream of the sun," she said, her voice soft. "When I was down there, I had almost forgotten what it felt like." She ran her hand along the smooth, new wood of the window frame. "I stepped up from this floor, and I will never go back under it again." Cole and June never spoke of marriage, not in the way other folks did. There was no grand proposal, no formal announcement. Their commitment was quieter. A simple, unspoken fact, as solid and dependable as the ground beneath their feet. One evening, as they sat together on the newly repaired porch, Cole pulled two thin, braided leather cords from his pocket. He had carved their initials into them, a simple C and J. He tied one around her wrist, and she tied the other around his. It was a promise, a simple, binding knot. He looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Doctor," he said, his voice a low, teasing drawl, "that needle of yours is still scarier than a rifle." June laughed, the sound warm and clear in the cool evening air. "I only use it," she replied, her eyes sparkling, "to stitch up stubborn hearts." The West was still a harsh and unforgiving land. The wind still carried the fine red dust that got into everything. But in Broken Mesa, something had shifted. The silence of fear had been replaced by the murmur of honest conversation. People looked each other in the eye again, and sometimes, if the wind was just right, it carried something else besides the dust. It carried the faint, clean scent of mint tea drifting from a small kitchen, and the sound of laughter echoing through a house that had forgotten how to be afraid. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.